Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into a massive, high-stakes standoff that is literally unfolding right now in May of 2026. It's this wild collision of constitutional law, highly advanced military technology, and global economics. You've got the executive branch pulling on one side, Congress pulling on the other, and the entire Middle East kind of just caught right in the middle of it all.
So think about this for a second. What happens when a strict 60-day legal countdown to end a war officially hits zero, but the fighting hasn't actually stopped? Imagine this ticking legal timer, and when it goes off, the military is supposed to completely stand down unless lawmakers give them the green light. But what if the very definition of fighting is up for debate? What if, the missiles have paused, but heavily armed warships are still actively blockading ports? Well, that is exactly the unprecedented gray area the United States and Iran are locked in right now.
Here is how we're going to break this down today. We'll start with the ticking clock, move into the constitutional tug-of-war, explore the drone complication, uncover the ceasefire loophole, and wrap up with a precarious stalemate.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, the ticking clock, focusing on Operation Epic Fury and the war powers deadline. To really get a grasp on the sheer tension in Washington today, we have to understand this specific timeline. 60. That is the magic number here. Under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, a president gets exactly 60 days to run military operations without getting explicit approval from Congress. Once that clock runs out, they either need Congress to step in and officially authorize the conflict, or they have to pull the troops out, though they can ask for a quick 30-day extension to withdraw safely. Now, the current conflict with Iran, which is internally dubbed Operation Epic Fury, kicked off in late February 2026. And as of right now, that 60-day clock is at zero.
But the White House is not backing down. President Trump has stated that he considers the War Powers Resolution to be totally unconstitutional, making it clear his administration won't be asking Congress for permission to continue. Their argument is basically that the hostilities effectively ended with a ceasefire agreement back on April 7th. They're saying, hey, because the active shooting has stopped, that 60-day limit just doesn't apply anymore. It is a really bold legal interpretation, and it perfectly sets the stage for the core of this debate.
Which brings us to Section 2. The constitutional tug-of-war between Congress and the Commander-in-Chief. Because to understand why a 60-day deadline is so incredibly controversial, we have to crack open the ultimate rulebook, the United States Constitution.
The framers of the Constitution actually built a tug-of-war right into the foundation of the government. Article 1 explicitly grants Congress the sole power to declare war. But then, Article 2 makes the president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which gives them the power to direct the military and take swift defensive action. This shared authority creates constant built-in friction. I mean, where exactly does the president's defensive power end and Congress's war-declaring power begin?
And this brilliantly illustrates how courts try to untangle that mess. They use something called the Youngstown Framework, which comes from a really famous Supreme Court case. It basically says a president has maximum authority when they act with Congress's blessing. When Congress is completely silent on an issue, the president operates in this murky zone of twilight. But, and this is key, when a president acts against the expressed will of Congress, like ignoring a statutory deadline, their authority drops to its absolute lowest point.
Let's take a quick look at the history here to see why this act even exists. During the Korean War, President Truman completely bypassed Congress. Fast forward to the Vietnam War, and President Nixon secretly ordered massive bombing campaigns in Cambodia without any congressional authorization. Lawmakers were so incredibly frustrated by this executive overreach that they passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, and they actually had to override Nixon's veto to do it. They wanted to aggressively rein in the executive branch and force presidents to consult them before going to war.
But here's where things get really tricky. Let's move to Section 3. The drone complication, looking at modern warfare and legal gray areas. Because, let's be real, the framers of the Constitution and even the politicians in 1973 could never have predicted the technology we have today.
This is the ultimate gray area. The U.S. operates a massive fleet of unmanned aircraft, like the $56 million MQ-9 Reaper. These things can literally loiter in the sky for 27 hours straight, tracking elusive targets and dropping lethal precision weapons like Hellfire missiles, all without a single American service member actually stepping foot on a battlefield. So it begs the question, does sending a flying robot to launch a missile trigger the exact same constitutional requirements as deploying an entire battalion of Marines?
The answer is incredibly complex, largely because drone strikes can escalate into major, all-out conflicts in the blink of an eye. Just look at the precedent set back in January 2020. A U.S. drone strike killed high-ranking Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. There were absolutely zero U.S. boots on the ground for that strike, but Iran immediately retaliated by launching a massive ballistic missile barrage at the Al-Assad air base in Iraq. Over 100 U.S. troops suffered traumatic brain injuries from the blasts. It's a sobering reminder of how a single, remote-controlled action can instantly push two nations to the absolute brink of full-scale war.
Which brings us to Section 4, the ceasefire loophole. Has the clock really stopped? Let's bring this right back to our current standoff in May 2026. Missiles aren't flying today, thanks to that early April ceasefire. But does a pause in the shooting actually stop that 60-day legal clock?
Well, it all comes down to the actual text of the law. The War Powers Act doesn't just use the word war. It specifically uses the word hostilities. And crucially, the law defines hostilities as situations where imminent involvement in combat is clearly indicated by the circumstances. So it's not just active shooting. It includes the immediate, lingering threat of combat.
And because of that specific wording, we are seeing two completely opposite interpretations clash right now. On one side, the administration, voiced by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, is arguing that the April ceasefire paused or completely stopped the 60-day clock because kinetic action, the actual bombing and firing, has ended. But on the other side, critics, including Democratic lawmakers like Senator Tim Kaine, as well as numerous legal experts, argue that because the ceasefire is incredibly fragile and a massive U.S. naval blockade is still ongoing, the threat of combat is absolutely imminent. To them, that clock never stopped ticking.
David Janowski from the Project on Government Oversight really hits the nail on the head here. He points out that maintaining a blockade is, historically speaking, considered an act of war in its own right. Even if bombs aren't currently dropping, U.S. forces are still actively boarding multiple Iranian ships. By that interpretation, hostilities are very much active.
So let's step away from the legal theories for a minute and move to Section 5, a precarious stalemate, looking at the actual ground reality in the Middle East. Because outside of the courtrooms in Washington, the military tension out there is at an absolute fever pitch peak.
Just look at the massive military moves happening right this second. The U.S. Navy is enforcing a strict maritime blockade and has actively turned back at least 13 Iranian ships. The U.S. just awarded a $100 million contract to an AI firm called Domino to help underwater drones hunt for Iranian sea mines. Meanwhile, Iran is fully activating its air defense systems, bracing for drone strikes. Oh, and the U.S. just shipped 6,500 tons of munitions and military equipment straight to Israel. I mean, come on, this doesn't look like a peaceful resolution at all. It looks like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And the global stakes? They are absolutely massive. Iran is maintaining a chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz. To put that into perspective, a staggering 20% of the world's crude oil flows directly through that narrow little waterway. The blockade and the looming threat of sea mines have choked off this vital route. That is enough to massively push up global energy prices and seriously threaten a worldwide economic downturn.
So what does this all mean? We find ourselves stuck in a totally unprecedented gray zone. The law says the time is up, the administration says the clock is on pause, and the militaries are fully bracing for impact. What happens when our 18th century Constitution, our 20th century laws, and our 21st century drone warfare all tragically collide? It's a question we might be finding the answer to very soon. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.